tonight what you're going to hear is Donald George is going to be interviewing two people that are very, very wonderful writers. Jason has returned to Book Passage after years and an extraordinary life event and an amazing book. So Jason was actually one of the small fry, like me, like so many of the other participants at one time, and now he's this amazing writer. He was here close to the beginning. I think went to the Writers Center for a little while, and really learned so much at the conference, but then went on to become a wonderful writer. And I think that this is our village, and this is where we get the tools to go out into the world and be able to do what we end up doing as journalists. So Don is going to be introducing him. His book, The Way of Wanderlust, is here. Yeganeh is also on the panel, Jason's wife. She was a prisoner in a prison in Iran for 72 days. And I just heard her speak about her Committee to Protect Journalists. It's an incredible organization, and she's doing a lot. I can't wait till you hear what she has to say. And then Jason will be talking about his 544-day ordeal as a prisoner in an Iranian prison, not knowing what was going on with Yeganeh for part of the time. It's a beautiful book. It's romantic. It's a book of strength and love, a story about place and the deepest, darkest corners of person. And I'm just so honored to be able to introduce them. It's going to be a lovely night. Donald, take it away.
I'm literally going to take it away here. Thank you, Linda, very much for the wonderful introduction. Thank you all so much for coming here tonight. It's wonderful to see so many people. And I want to especially thank Jason and Yeganeh for being here. It's really, really a pleasure, an honor, a privilege to have you here. So can you hear me okay in the back? So I actually didn't realize until very, 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 very recently Jason's original connection with the Book Passage Travel Writers and Photographers Conference. And I was delighted to find out about it. But can you talk a little bit more, since we are here?
Sure.
Once upon a time, you were actually a participant sitting in those chairs looking up here at the stage.
That's true. I've been coming to Book Passage since I was in high school. This was my bookshop. I grew up in San Rafael, and from a pretty early age, I spent a lot of time there. I think most of you who are similarly aged, between maybe 20 and 60. If you're local, you probably got your first driver's license, like I did right here. And this is kind of, and went and stood in line to watch Star Wars movies, right over there. And so this little stretch of road has been an integral part of my life since I was a little kid. I came to the Travel Writing Conference for the first time right after I graduated from college in the year 2000. And I knew that I wanted to write professionally, but I wasn't sure how you go about doing that. And I had the fortunate opportunity to travel to many countries at a young age, and knew that I wanted to do more of that. So this was a wonderful experience for me. I learned so much from some people who are still on faculty, including Don and Linda. Linda and I have taken several classes from Linda over the years, and it's really exciting to be back here. And in that first conference, is there still a writing contest component?
Very much so.
Yeah, so I hope all of you who are participating have submitted essays for the contest. I'll tell you that I took honorable mention. So I'm looking to see who is going to be the honorable mention. I assume big thanks for that.
That's great. So that was
2000, and I came back again in 2001, and then once again a couple of years later. And I want to say that 2 years ago, in July of 2017, I came to town and I reached out to Elaine. I hadn't been in touch with her in many years. And I told her, we sat in the coffee shop over there and talked about the book that I was writing. And she was as enthusiastic and supportive as she is with all writers. And she said, you're going to come back and you're going to come to the conference when the book comes out. And so here we are. And you could, if you're a working writer or an aspiring writer, you could have no better friend than Elaine and Book Passage. So it's a really special day. Feels very full circle. We've been going around the country for the past 6 months talking about our experience and this book, but coming back home is very gratifying.
welcome home.
Thank you.
Great to have you back. Well, that's pretty inspiring, I think, for a lot of people who are here at the conference for the first time or the third time or the 12th time. What you've done with your career post-Book Passage. Can you just briefly outline for people kind of the trajectory, your professional trajectory,
Sure.
so we have a sense of that?
Yeah, so I was, from that first conference until 2009, trying to figure out how do you begin a career in writing, especially if you haven't got a real clear path into it. You know, a lot of people study journalism and they get an internship their senior year in college at a newsroom, and then the next year they're hired on at that newsroom or a different newsroom. I hadn't done any of that stuff. So I had to kind of figure it out. And during that time I fell in love with Iran. I started traveling there in 2001, and every year I'd make a couple of trips. My father came from Iran. My mother was from the Midwest. They chose to raise my big brother and me right here in Marin County, which was about as far away psychologically and ideologically as those two places. But there was a draw. And I knew that if I could go to Iran and write about Iran, it would be a rich opportunity and one that would never bore me, to be honest. And it wasn't easy. You know, I had pieces published in different publications over the years, but to augment my travels, I worked in my dad's Persian rug shop. And those of you who are local, have been here for a long time, know the building that he built in Tam Junction. But don't ask me about anything that's happened in that shop post 1986, because that was the last time we were there. You know, I ended up working with my dad in Petaluma, where he had a store for a long time. And then I opened up a shop myself in San Francisco, right off of Union Square, in the spring of 2008, which was not exactly. And you know, before the crisis hit, I remember the first day I was open. I had big banners in the window, grand opening sale, and all of this. And a middle-aged couple walked by, and the door was open. It was an unusually hot day in May in San Francisco. And the husband said to his wife, "This place has been closing since the day it opened." Today is the day I opened. So it was, was rough from the start. And by October of 2009, 5 months into this endeavor, I realized that this was not going to be an era to sell Persian rugs. It was probably an era to sell Persian stories. And I closed the doors of my shop in May of 2009. Bought a one-way ticket to Tehran, which to a lot of people seems pretty rash. But that was right before the big election in 2009, and ultimately the Green Movement and the protests that followed. And until the day I was arrested, I was never out of work. And that's, I don't want to spoil the ending for aspiring writers, but that's a pretty rare thing. So if you can find an opportunity that's, or a gig that's so consistent that everybody in the world wants to publish what you have to say about the place, you're on something.
When you went there, were you thinking, I'm going to become a journalist?
I knew that this is what I was going to do. I had published some articles over the years in the Chronicle, actually, and I was filing stories about that election for the Chronicle and for Slate.
From here, or after you got there?
After I got there. And the day before that election, I wrote a piece that ended up getting picked up by the New York Times. And that was really kind of the beginning.
And what happened after that? What kind of was the next phase?
Well, the very next phase was that election happened and journalists were kicked out of Iran. And I was told to leave as well, and I left for a period of time, and that's when I met Yegi. We happened to both be in Dubai for a short period of time and had a chance encounter, and that was 10 years ago last month.
Wow. 10 years ago last month.
Yeah. And I came back to Iran, and from the end of 2009 until 2014, and up until now, I was the only U.S. citizen working as a correspondent in Iran on a permanent basis. I ended up getting hired by the Washington Post in 2012, and still work for the Post.
Great. Great. I have more questions about that. But Yegi, I want to ask you what you thought about this young man when you first met him.
She didn't think I was that young.
How did that happen, and what was going on in your head?
Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. And thanks to Elaine and Book Passage for hosting us. Thank you for spending your Saturday night with us. Well, what did I think? Jason likes to say that it was love at first sight on his side. I think it was love at first sight for both of us. As I told earlier in the session I had with Jeff since I was 9 years old, I always knew that I'm going to marry an American. Wow. I had no idea because I was always fascinated with the culture and I always wanted to travel and see this amazing country and meet the people and get their real stories, separate from everything that the Islamic Republic regime fed me and the people from my generation who were born after the '79 revolution. So I remember when I was probably 9 years old, I told my mom that I would like to marry an American, and she said, yeah, I was dreaming marrying a Japanese guy.
How did that work out?
So then we met, and I was fascinated with his stories. He's an amazing storyteller, and right off the bat, he told me many, many great stories, and he's extremely kind-hearted. It was very important for me that he grew up in an incredible, open-minded place like Marin County. At the same time, because of his dad, he had some exposure to the Persian culture and the language and food, everything. So it worked out perfect.
So I'm guessing, well, And you would,
And
yes.
I'm sorry for
No,
interrupting
please,
you. I
please.
remember, I mean, if you grew up in one of those third world countries, you either want, the parents constantly tell you that you're either going to be a doctor or you have to marry a doctor, something like that. And I remember from the very early on, I told him that I love the fact that he's a writer. That is very important. I was fascinated by the fact that he was not just thinking about being a journalist or do his journalism work in a perfect way. I love it that he was a writer, and I always knew he was going to write a book. I just didn't know the book would be about that experience.
That wasn't in the script. And did you want to be a writer at that point too?
Interestingly, I got a master's degree in English literature, so I was also very fascinated with literature, both Persian and English. And I remember at the time when I was probably 20, 21, I had a professor who was telling me about this amazing course in the US universities called creative writing, and I was like, oh wow, what's that? And then I met a guy who had a degree in creative writing, so I was fascinated with it.
That may be the only time in history a degree in creative writing. Such a big
It doesn't play as well in the bars in San
Before he was a correspondent for the Washington Post, and I remember he was telling me that I'm not gonna be rich. Writers are not necessarily rich.
I'm definitely not going to be a doctor.
So I have a feeling that the dating customs in Tehran are different from Madrid, probably.
Very much,
How
at
did-
least back then.
How did that work out? How were you able to develop your relationship?
I think Jason is more equipped to answer this question because I think it is more interesting from his point of view. Because I was born in Tehran, I was raised in Tehran, lived my entire life in Tehran until I left in 2016. So the limitations that are both culturally and politically and traditionally are imposed on people from my generation who were born after the revolution seems relatively normal to me, but I'm sure they were not okay with the guy who
I mean, not okay. I mean, it turned out to be okay, but I mean, there's no living together before marriage.
No.
Right? So we can start there. No, I mean, we found ways to spend time together. We spent a lot of time on the phone. It's kind of like dating in the 8th grade. Before the advent of text messaging, we spent a lot of time. I think it was a really sweet courtship. We spent. You showed me a lot of Tehran. We went to museums together and parks, and it wasn't like we were taking trips around the country together because you can't do that. And it's incremental, right? I met her sister, and then months later I met her mom. And a couple years after that I met her dad.
one step at a time.
It was challenging, but it was also, I was part of a very small community of other dual nationals, right? And we were all navigating the same situation. So it was unique and different. And everything about it, alcohol, for example, is illegal in Iran, which makes it, again, like drinking in high school. We don't do that here, right? But you get a thrill out of having a beer when you're 33 years old. You're just excited for a beer. Yeah.
As Jason says, Iran is a very fascinating place and it never disappoints until it really disappoints.
Yeah.
So it adds to the level of fascination.
Absolutely. So I wanted to ask you you both because Iran is absolutely such a fundamental part of your lives. What is it, well, first of all, I want to ask you, what did you fall in love with in Iran at first? What made you kind of love Iran?
So many different aspects of it, but I think that to pinpoint it, it was the place that I visited that was completely itself, right? You know, you can go to anywhere in Europe and feel like you could be, there's a corner of every city in Europe that makes you feel like you could be in San Francisco or New York or London or wherever. When you're in Iran, you're in Iran. And
What does that mean when you say that? What's
well,
an image?
I mean, so you know, you walk down the street and you know, you wonder where the McDonald's or the Starbucks is, and it's not there, right? And so that's kind of cool. But also, there is a self-contained element of it where, you know, you're in a city like Tehran that has 14 million people. It's very frenetic and chaotic and lots of traffic. But everybody there feels as though they can have a conversation with everybody else. You know, you get into these taxi cabs that are shared taxi cabs. It's like the Uber pool before that was a thing. So you know, you get in a car and there's a driver and you don't know anybody else who's in there with you. And it's a very intimate experience. They're tiny little cars and there's 3 people in the back and there's one guy driving and one guy riding shotgun, and industrious drivers put one person in the middle between him and the passenger. And you might be straddling a stick shift because all the cars are get to know people in that sort of environment. And I think sort of the barriers to basic human contact are lower, but deeper human relationships don't come easy. And so it's a challenging place to figure out, and one that I never once got bored while I was there.
And you were always kind of trying to figure it out.
You're still trying to figure it out. And you probably feel the same way about Japan, right?
Absolutely.
And so it's like it's that kind of curiosity that fueled my experience.
Yeah, endlessly intriguing.
Always.
Yeah. Yegi, what do you love about Iran?
What don't I love? It's my home. It's my yes, I love America, and I'm extremely appreciative about America adopting me.
We're so happy to have you.
Thank you. In fact, I'm a new citizen. I'm a new American.
Anniversary, right?
Of becoming a citizen.
Yes.
Yes.
We are the richer for it.
Yeah. Thank you. Means a lot to me. But that's my home. That's my identity. That's where I grew up. That's everything I know. That's where all of my memories have formed. All of my best friends, my parents still live there. I have siblings there, so it's everything. And then after all, for nothing but 2 things: because of my job as a journalist, and above that, for marrying a guy who is only half foreign, I have been banned from my country. So that's extremely painful. I now have that love and hate relationship with it, that I love everything about it, but I hate the idea of probably it's something different from hate. It's a little sense of fear that I love it so much, but I'm scared about even thinking about going back, because I feel like not the people, but somehow I have been betrayed. They took my husband hostage. They made me feel miserable. And I still have many fond memories of many good people. There were taxi drivers who took me around for more than a year. when Jason was in prison, and they never charged me.
Wow.
Just because these guys have such great hearts. And as Jason said, the human relationship is so deep. And every time I remember I told that guy that, please, this is not acceptable, you have to charge. He said, I will never charge a woman who does not have her husband with her, or the protection of her husband. Any day that he's out, you can ask him to come and pay me. which didn't happen. He's out, but we're kicked out, so I didn't have a chance to go back to him. But I have also, unfortunately, through our experience, met people that consistently question my love for my husband. I've met people that ask me, why did you marry this guy? What's special about this foreign guy? There was something wrong with a man like me. Why didn't you marry your cousin? So I feel I have a little bit of, I feel a little bit disgusted thinking about those folks.
Right. So it sounds to me like you hold two Irans in your heart, kind of.
True.
Yeah.
True.
If I, as a visitor, were to go to Iran and were to experience the Iran that you love, what would I experience, do you think?
Well, you will arrive, and I think the best example is what Tony said about Anthony Bourdain. Said about his time in Iran that it's a fascinating place. It's not east, it's not west, it's something in the middle. And people are extremely warm and welcoming and hospitable, and they especially love Americans. And as soon as, if you're a little bit blonde or you have blue eyes, they don't think about you as a German or European or French or anything. They immediately think of you as American, and they would love to invite you to their homes and cook for you. It's a historic place. There are many, many places you can go and visit all around the country. People are nice. I can't promise about what the government think or would do. I hope all people can go one day. There is a day that everyone can go freely and just experience the beautiful land and amazing people who have been taken hostage for a long time.
We all hope that. What was your experience as a visitor, even, I mean a working visitor, but still as a visitor, what was your experience of Iran? Are Yegi's words resonating for you?
100%. And I think it's one of these places that the deeper you get into it, the harder you fall for it, but the more complicated things become. So, working in Iran has also, especially if you're a foreigner, but for anybody, has a lot of hoops that you have to jump through. The bureaucracy of working there, or just getting there. I mean, some of you, I'm sure, have tried to travel there and get a visa. It's pretty complicated. But once you're in, you're there, right? It's like a wonderland of possibilities and experiences. And I felt, I think it might have changed a bit since we left. It's been 5 years since I was free in Iran, but that doors were open to you as a foreign person living there, right? Lots of people wanted to bring you into their lives, and that's certainly so for travelers who visit for short periods of time. But for those of us who are there for extended periods, the range of opportunities to connect with people, and for somebody who's working as a journalist, that's incredible, right? I mean, I wrote about so many different types of people while I lived there, from pretty high level officials, business people, athletes, artists, but also people, struggling in poverty. I did a big piece about women who were recovering drug addicts, and that's the sort of thing that average Iranian or Iranian journalists would have a tough time covering, because those people would not feel as comfortable letting somebody from their own society into their difficult world. So I felt I had a lot of privilege, and with that privilege came this responsibility to not break eggs.
Right. There's a couple of quotes from your book that I want to read. First of all, I just want to say, excuse me, if you don't own this book, you should own this book.
Multiple copies.
Multiple. Exactly. It's a really, really extraordinary read. I read it, I think, in one sitting, basically. It's just an amazingly compelling story, beautifully told, and it belongs in every house. There's a couple of quotes that really struck me that I would like you to just talk about a little bit. One is, you said, and you'll give the backstory. Maybe everybody already knows the backstory, but after I say this quote, you can sort of fill in the backstory. You said, trading for rugs and hostages is pretty much the same.
So, I mentioned that I was in the rug business, and clearly from my story, I consider myself part of this long history of U.S. nationals taken hostage by the Islamic Republic. And most of you remember our first brush with the Islamic Republic in 1979, and the long ordeal that was very much part of the public consciousness on a nightly basis. People forget that Nightline, the television show, was spawned from this thing that became a national crisis. Another thing that people don't think about was the impact that period had on Iranians living in this country. My dad immigrated to the United States in 1959, well before the revolution, had no political aspirations. He was a businessman. Got a green card in the late 60s, and by the mid-70s, he was an American citizen. But from the moment that the hostages were taken, he and every other small business owner who happened to be from Iran originally became the subject of intense scrutiny, attacks, harassment. And that was even so here in Marin County. I mean, the shop is 4 miles up the road, down the road. And so he was deeply affected by that experience of having his livelihood cut off because of where he came from. And he always, after that experience, when asked, where he was from, because my dad, some of you might have known him, met him, spoke English very well, but with a very thick accent. He was more of a numbers guy than a literature guy. And people would ask him, where are you from? And he said, I'm Iranian by birth and I'm American by choice. And I'm proud of both. And so when the hostages were released finally in January of 1981, many businesses around the country, different communities, had this outpouring of love and support for the returning hostages that manifested itself in gifts. So, Omaha, Nebraska sent them years' supplies of steaks if they wanted them. Hawaii's tourism board invited them all for an all-expense-paid vacation. Major League Baseball gave each one of the former hostages 2 golden tickets that they could use at every major league stadium during the regular season for the rest of their lives. And I know some of those former hostages, and they're still using those. And one of the gifts was from my dad, who extended an offer of a Persian rug from this shop to the returning hostages. And of the 52, 40-something took them up on it. And some of them came here to Malawi, some of them sent people in their place, some of them called and said, will you send me something like this? And one of those former hostages has, his Iranian wife actually, have become good friends of Yegi and I. They live in Northern Virginia, right outside of DC. And we've gone to visit him, and every time we go to the house, it's a rug about this size, and he kicks over the corner and the label for my dad's shop.
That's great. So in your case, what's the trading for rugs? How does that apply to your situation?
I mean, ultimately, when you're taken by the Iranian regime, I do these conversations a lot, and people ask me, but why did they take you? Why, if you're not a spy or if you weren't doing anything, what were they thinking that you were doing? They didn't think I was doing anything. They just thought I was an American who would have value in a negotiation with the United States. And so it really became front and center in my mind after a few months that my ordeal here is only going to come to an end when the United States government decides to step in and give these people whatever they want. And I read a lot about hostages in Iran and in other places because unfortunately more and more governments are doing this. And it's a multi-pronged problem. We have to figure out how to compel governments not to take hostages, first of all. But more importantly for me personally is figuring out how to bring those people who are being held hostage, especially in Iran, but in other countries as well, home. Because if our safety as American citizens, wherever we are in the world, is not a priority for our government, then something's very wrong. So it's multi-pronged. We have to figure out how to solve the problem. But for me, the thing that keeps me up at night is what can I do today to help those guys that are still there come back? And what I've figured out is that they're not coming back until it's politically important enough for whatever American administration's in office. So I press that button every chance I get.
Yeah, and we all should.
Yeah, everybody should.
Yeah. Thank you. And the other quote was, I was now a living centerpiece in a struggle that I had spent years through my explanatory writings seeking to diffuse.
It's one of the great sadnesses of my life that I spent years covering this place in, I don't want to say in neutral tones, because that's not true, but trying to explain the place in, its beauty and ugliness and everything in between, with the intent of informing American readers, right? I went there knowing that I knew something about the place, its culture, its people, and that the reports that I could send from there would have value. And when we were taken, it was at the height of negotiations between Iran, the US, and other world powers over Iran's nuclear program. And the fact that I got caught up in the middle of that and became, a storyline in the story that I've been covering, it's not anything that any journalist ever hopes to happen. And then when it does, it's very rare that journalist has the opportunity to write about it ever again. Because unfortunately most people don't come home. If you become part of the story, more than likely it means you didn't come back. And so I came back and decided that I was going to finish that story and report the heck out of it, and hoped that the product would resonate and would explain something that still hadn't been explained.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to ask you both, because it raises I mean, your life story, the story of the imprisonment, is so emotionally charged that I want to talk about that. But first, I want to ask just a craft question, actually, because we're all sort of learning writers here. You both, from different perspectives, are trying to explain, or are trying to explain Iran to people who aren't necessarily familiar with it. Yegi, I'm going to ask you first. What are some of the practices that you put into place, or how are you thinking about a story to do that as effectively as possible?
Wow, that's such an interesting question. First of all, I always try to make sure that my audience, whoever they are, I do a good job of differentiating between the government and the people of Iran, because Iranian people are very ordinary people that you can meet anywhere with the same hopes and dreams and aspirations. They don't want anything except good life for themselves and children. And I really believe 85%, 90% of the population is really done with this regime. So they just want to break that shell and come out free. But also, I write about Iran these days less. When I was in Iran and reporting for a foreign audience back then, as Jason taught me to do, was I didn't need to necessarily write super hard news political stories, because I think Western people, especially Americans, have read a lot of those stories, but that does not necessarily make you learn about that society. We read every day in the news that President Trump said this, so the President Rouhani from Iran said this. It's like a constant football, as Americans say, soccer, that they are playing against each other. Instead, just tell the stories of ordinary people. Think that wherever you are from, whatever walks of life you come from, you can relate to someone else in different part of the world. Family stories. I should not spoil Jason's answer, but I love that his last byline from Tehran was the story he wrote about Iran's national baseball team. I doubt many Americans even knew that Iran has a national baseball team that, in fact, is not in like a really lower level among the international baseball league. It's doing better than Iran's soccer team. And I remember when his story came out, within 24 hours, the response he got on social media and the number of emails that Americans sent to him saying, what can we do for this team? How can we send supplies for this team? These are the stories that people can easily relate to. If you read that story on the surface, it was the story of ordinary people, but basically the politics was within the lines. You could eventually get to that. All of this is happening because of this. The major reason is this. So you don't necessarily need to tell super political stories. Just make it relatable to the people. I think the reason that many people, no matter where they come from or what age they are, really loved Anthony Bourdain's show, and they all watched it and they got to travel with him, was because he wouldn't go necessarily into a place and tell a political story. He was getting out to a new country, talking to everybody over a meal, that we can all relate to food. Whatever, one of our friends were saying that at the time that the election, 2016 election happened, one side of his family were Hillary Clinton fans and one side were Donald Trump fan, and they were always fighting, but when it came to sharing a meal together at dinner, they all got along, and they were even able to exchange their political views in a nice, civilized, friendly way. So I think just tell the stories of who we are. We're all human beings.
Great. Great answer.
What she said. No, I mean, it was always for me really important, like Yegi said, to tell stories of real people, because I realized that if I wanted to do it the way that everybody else did it, I wouldn't last very long. And that's not why I got into it. And there's always going to be an AP and a Reuters and an AFP that are going to tell you the story of the latest, missile test, or what the Friday prayer leader said at Friday prayers, or what the Supreme Leader said. That's all going to be there. I'm here on the ground. The value that I can add is to tell you what it's really like. And so, I try to put myself in the shoes of Iranians on a daily basis and write about how U.S. policy and their own governments and policies affected the lives of people. So I wrote a lot about sanctions, and the baseball story was basically a sanctions story. These guys love baseball, they want to play baseball. They don't have access to balls. They have to make their own mitts and bats, and they love it that much. And, I knew that Americans would read that. So this is one of these things where I made the connection between an unexpected phenomenon in a faraway place that resonated so much with readers that, like Yegi said, people were writing to me saying, how can we ship them a supply of balls and cleats and all of this? 2 days later, I was arrested. It had nothing to do with that article, but you haven't read another article like that in the 5 years and 1 month since I was arrested, because there hasn't been an American based on the ground. I read a lot of articles about what the leader said, or what Trump or John Bolton and Mike Pompeo say about Iran. You read that every day, but you don't have that granular feel, because frankly, Yegi and I were 40% of the English language news media in Iran at the time.
That have not been replaced.
Had not been replaced.
Wow. That is the most perfect metaphor, to my mind, for what great travel writing does too, because it creates those bridges between cultures.
Exactly.
People who have this indivisible, or this gap between them that you think you can't ever bridge. You write a story like that, and suddenly there's this incredible bridge that you've just built, human bridge, where people feel this connection, and the great other becomes this very friendly, warm. I get it. They love baseball. I love baseball, and I mean, we're here at a travel writers conference. That's what great travel writing does. It builds those bridges. Absolutely, I was incredibly inspired, moved to hear that. I'm looking at the clock and I don't want it to move anymore. So I have a lot more questions. So I'll try to, this wonderful, amazing, extraordinary, moving, compelling account, 544 days in an Iranian prison. I guess the one question I want to ask you is, what was the hardest part of writing this book?
I'm trying to think what the easiest part was. No, I think so. The hardest part, and I don't want to ruin the ending, but the second to last chapter, which is the chapter that is about our ultimate release and everything that went into that happening and almost not happening. And it was. I've been working on the book continuously for about 1.5 years, and I had a deadline at the end of May of last year to deliver my manuscript, and I still hadn't written this chapter. I had about 5 days to go. I knew exactly what I wanted to say. Everything else was done. I had written the last chapter of the book before I'd written anything else.
Wow.
And we talked yesterday a bit about structure. Write a book the way it works for you. For me, it was, write all the component parts and then, take pieces of the jigsaw puzzle and put it together. But that last part was so hard because there was so much anger, fear. It was the closing of a chapter in both of our lives. And it had a visceral effect on me to write this. So I'm glad that it only took me a few days to get it done. People ask me all the time if it was cathartic to write this book. No. It's cathartic to have it done. I don't have to be talking about it now. But the process of writing this, it wasn't like, I'm going to wake up this morning, I'm going to feel so great, it's going to be like yoga. It was not like that.
Probably dredged up all the bad memories, huh?
Of course, lots of bad memories.
Yes, yeah. This is a question for both of you. What was the biggest lesson that you took away from Captivity?
I think for me the biggest lesson was that no matter how difficult the circumstances you're facing are in a particular moment, somebody else is going through circumstances more difficult than you are. And I had the experience of having 2 cellmates throughout my time. One of them had already been in the same prison for 2.5 years before I got there. And he made it that long. The other guy, who I ended up spending a year with, was from the Republic of Azerbaijan, right across the border. He didn't speak a word of Farsi or English. Couldn't really communicate with our captors. His family was 1,000 miles away. He had no insight into how the place worked. Hadn't spent time dealing with Iranian bureaucracy. And was arrested 10 days before I was. So on literally every single count, I was in an easier situation than this guy. That's how I looked at it. And so, I took that with me through the experience. Okay, yesterday was really hard. Hopefully today will be a little bit easier. And maybe tomorrow I won't be here. Right? And you just have to keep telling yourself that until you're at book passage 3.5 years later.
It may sound like a cliche answer, but I think survival and then trust. If you survive many, many days of prison, especially solitary confinement, then you know you can survive anything else. Because I describe solitary confinement as a grave that they put you in while you're still alive. So all of your senses, you can hear, you can see, but there's nothing to be seen. You are deep underground that no one can hear you, no one can see you. And then trust, because I'm sure many of you have experienced this by different virtue, but we know our loved ones and our friends and even our enemies better when we are going through hardships. Because when life is beautiful and everything is great, everybody's around. And it's at those very difficult moments that you know your real friends. If you can trust your loved ones, if they're still there for you, if they're willing to go through this with you. So I'm now very selective when it comes to who's my friend, who I should trust, who I can't trust, and who I shut down right away. out of my life because of everything that I have experienced. So yeah. And unfortunately, there were several couples that were going through a similar experience. At least one other American who was in prison at the time with Jason in a separate location. He had a wife and children, and I remember at the time his wife was fighting so very hard for his release, and then after he got out eventually, their marriage did not last because it is such a heavy experience. And despite the fact that you are fighting for that person, the experience somehow changes you for better or worse. So the fact that we trusted each other throughout the whole experience, and we still trust each other for no matter what happens. So the fact that we never surprise each other because we just want to know
No surprises.
what is happening. Also because we can't hide anything from each other, even for happy reasons. So, yeah, trust and so on.
It's an incredibly moving answer. I feel like we've just been given access to a little sacred moment here. So what's been the biggest lesson since you've been free?
Life is filled with lessons when you're free. You just gotta keep your eyes open, your ears open, and experience things. I think in those first days and weeks of freedom, I was sort of curious why I wasn't happier. And I mean, we all know this on a kind of molecular level, but happiness doesn't really come from your surroundings. It comes from other sources. And I don't know. I mean, I've learned to be very patient with both of us, and less patient with some other people, right? To Yegi's point about knowing who to trust and who not to trust. And I think that also we on a very different level. I mean, we came out in 2016, at the beginning of 2016, during a very different political moment than the one that we're living in right now. And it was a very warm reception. And we continue to have a warm reception in some parts of the country. But it was an eye-opener just to see how quickly, and I guess part of that's because we live in Washington, D.C. now, but to see how quickly the tables turned. And it's just a reminder to me, to us, to just keep being who we are and not, the Iranians have a term, the party of the wind, the people who will blow a different direction when the political tides change. And we haven't done that. We're just who we are. Take us or leave us.
We'll take it.
Thank you.
What was the question?
What's been the biggest lesson since you've been free?
I think just as Jason said, stay true to yourself. If you are who you are, you should not change because the political scene changed. Also, I think when you experience, as I go back to, if you experience prison, especially solitary confinement, after that when you freely, first of all, when you have the free will of choice, so you deeply appreciate that. Also, everything, you look at the blue sky, you're like, I'm not a religious person at all, but you think to yourself, thanks to whatever. For some people it's golf, for some people it's an energy. That I have this opportunity to look at the blue sky this morning, or have a bite of an apple. I remember at the time in prison I really somehow craved apple. Or when you take a warm shower, just water running on your face, the fact that you were still alive, it could have ended in 1,000 other different, sadder, darker ways. So the gift of coming back to life and have freedom.
So I'm going to open the floor up to questions.
There's been a lot written about the danger that journalists have when they're overseas, and perhaps now even in our own country. But some of us who aren't as knowledgeable are very concerned about how can journalists be protected. I mean, I'm sure you've thought about it, who are with the Post or the Times, and they're, you know, in dangerous places. Is there anything that any of us could do, or, you know, ways to somehow ensure that you are free? I mean, historically, journalists were not arrested, and they would be free to, they might be asked to leave, but they weren't in danger like you were.
All right, so the question is, how can journalists be protected? What can we do?
That's your floor today.
We had a session about this earlier today. So right now I work for the Committee to Protect Journalists. And what we do is to document every attack, every assault, every threat that is imposed on journalists everywhere, globally, and also here at home. And I think journalists, whoever they are, whatever they write about, whatever their views are, should be free to report and bring us information, because what would we'd be without not having information about other places, even other corner of this huge country. Imagine if you never hear about whatever that happens in DC or New York, or if there's a flood, things like this. It starts from every single one of us. I would say by, as I said earlier, by support your local journalists, and then when it gets to the bigger scene, keep people in power accountable. Don't let this anti-press rhetoric get any bigger than what already is, especially here in this country. Because as I said, America used to be this great beacon of hope, carrying the torch in support of freedom of the press and human rights abuses everywhere. And people everywhere else look up to America for having that leadership role that unfortunately is now missing. I find Americans a very, very forgiving nation. But I hope American people become more politically active. Vote. Don't think because you live in California you should not vote, or your vote doesn't count. If there is any way that you can get involved in your local politics, I would really hope to see a day now as an American we get rid of this electoral college system. Because there are countries who impose cash fine on their people for not showing up to the polling stations. They turn their election on a weekend, or they declare it as a national holiday so more people can go and vote. I feel like here there is a systematic push to stop people, to prevent people from going to vote. So make sure you keep your people in power accountable so America goes back to its leadership role. And I told earlier, maybe I should repeat that number. Since President Trump announced his candidacy for presidential race, he sent out 1,300 tweets out attacking journalists and media, whether media as a whole or singling out journalists. In half of those tweets, he used the term fake news. Since then, the number of journalists who have been arrested globally under the term fake news have been tripled. Turkey never used the term fake news before. Now they arrest people, journalists, and the guy did not make any crime. I mean, he did not do anything wrong. He's just a journalist. But it's so easy that they say, he committed a fake news crime. What is that? I mean, it's not defined anywhere. So it starts from here.
One thing I would add is subscribe to a local newspaper
Yeah.
and a national one if you don't already. But you know, support independent news.
Yes.
Hi.
Sam?
So, for those of us who were here and were following what was going on social media and whatnot, do you think it actually helps for people to sign those petitions and to share this information? I guess probably the bigger question is, what can we do? I understand the political piece of it, but just on a day-to-day basis, for people who are wrongfully accused and imprisoned, what else could we do a world away?
So on a day-to-day basis, what can we do to help free people who have been wrongfully imprisoned?
I was under the impression and hope very early on that people would be very loud and stand in solidarity with me, talk about me as a person, as an individual, things that I had done, things that I had been involved with, because I think that transparency is sort of poison to these kinds of cases. And ultimately, when you find yourself in one of these predicaments like we did, you also, I mean, I was put on trial in the Revolutionary Court. And if you ever find yourself on trial that's got revolutionary in its name, you're not going to win. And I mean, that's just a fact. When we were released, we were on the flight out. There were two other, you mentioned one of them. There was another gentleman who was a former Marine with us that was released. And I said to him, I said, you know, what do you think the conviction rate at the Revolutionary Court is? High 90s? He said, no, Jason, it's got to be at least 110%. And so, you know, you just know that the battle that you're fighting is not the one in the court that you're actually appearing in physically. It's the battle that's taking place in the court of public opinion that I believe helped galvanize our plight to such an important level at a time when negotiations between Iran and the U.S. were reaching a crescendo. That, you know, the headline, if you go back and look at the days following that deal, the day following that deal, you know, it's Americans released in, you know, nuclear deal. The headline would have been, Americans continue to languish in prison, and we just gave Iran all these concessions, right? So it's a strange thing to be in that situation where you're wrapped up and equated in it, but as I said earlier, for me, the priority is how we can get this one guy home. I have that luxury because I'm not a politician, right? I also have a platform, multiple platforms available to me to make that heard over and over and over again. You know, people ask me all the time, why do you keep writing about these hostages? I write about these hostages because they're still hostages, right? If people didn't do that for me, we wouldn't be here today.
Right. Another question? Okay, way in the back. I didn't quite.
International. If an organization like that has any positive effect on helping resolve things.
Does Amnesty International have a positive effect in cases like this?
No. Unfortunately, no.
I think they have they help publicize it.
But they don't have any political power in terms of, in a country like Iran, they don't even let Amnesty International officials or like a delegation from Amnesty International or UN to come in to observe elections, to meet with prisoners. No. I mean, something is better than nothing. It's better to have organizations like that, as Jason said, to raise awareness and bring publicity to those cases, but they don't have any political power.
As a practical matter, is it easy or impossible or difficult for the two of you to communicate with people in Iran now?
Not impossible, not easy, and something that I think we're always very aware of. I mean, I get people reaching out to me all the time. More often than not, I don't respond unless I know them. And the people that I do communicate with, that I do know, that aren't relatives, I try and find other ways to communicate with them than, obvious ways, because I just assume that they might be under surveillance. Does that answer that? Okay.
Yeah, the two of you have such a beautiful rapport. Just the trust you're talking about is so obvious, and you guys are such a team. I'm just curious, in the writing of the book, Yegi, were you like, was there? I mean, I assume you guys talked about it. I'm just curious what your involvement in it was. If you wanted to be near it, if you wanted to be away from it.
So the question is for Yegi, what role, given the fantastic, beautiful rapport that you two have, what role did you play in the writing of the book?
I think there were moments that I was really close to first of all, I was really close to the entire process because Jason was writing major parts of it at home. But then there were stories that I read the first draft before he shared with other people, or I read them several times, and there were parts of it that we talked about everything, not because of the book, but right away. Imagine as a couple, when we first got out of Iran, we spent many, many nights staying up, just talking about every little things that I knew about after I was released out from the outside world, and little things that happened to him while he was still detained that I wasn't with him, so we talked. I think it's really fair and safe to say that we try to make sure there's nothing that we hide from each other, because many people, for example, come out of these experiences, and if one of them has been physically assaulted or is psychologically so disturbed they never share with each other. We wanted to make sure there are not secret dark moments that we don't know about between the two of us. And I think he's answered the rest of it. I think I was pretty close to the entire process.
Incredibly close, and I mean, it was very important on a kind of mechanical level to figure out timelines of events, what was going on in the outside world, things that were said to her by officials or my brother or my mom. I mean, just figuring out the whole thing. But then also on a kind of a support level. I mean, writing the difficult parts of the book, there were weeks on end that I was suffering from nightmares.
Every time he had a nightmare, I knew those weeks he's writing about the hardest part of the experience.
And I mean, it's not, not every spouse is going to put up with that. And I think it helped that, I think it helped us in a weird way that Yegi had experienced exactly the same things that I had. I mean, the beginning of this ordeal and the end of it, we were together.
And somewhere in the middle.
And, you know,
For example, we heard from other former ex-cons, former ex-cons, that the husband was arrested. He went through the arrest scene, and then he was in prison. But the wife never had those experiences, so the understanding is difficult. You can relate to those stories. If you have never been to solitary confinement, then you don't know what your husband or your wife is talking about. If you have never been interrogated, you don't know what you were suffering from after that experience. So the fact that I shared a little bit of those, like we were arrested together, and then they were released. We left Iran together.
and then I think also the fact that, you know, towards the middle to the end of my time in prison after Yegi was out, she was able to come and see me for an hour every week. And just being able to have a grasp of the psychological situation that I was in, and my being able to kind of see the struggles from her end of hopelessness and, you know, helplessness of the situation, I think it made it a lot. I don't want to say easier, but, you know, it made it possible for us to be softer on each other when we came out.
And understand each other.
Yeah.
I think, given the time, I'm sorry, and maybe you can ask later on, but I'm going to ask one more question.
Sure.
I saved one easy question for last. So given both of your amazing journeys in life so far, I'm wondering now, and I'll ask Yegi to answer first, and then you, Jason, what do you feel the purpose of your life is?
Pass.
There are many things I would like to do, but for now I just want to focus, as I said, because of the fate that I suffered from, because of the nature of the job that I was doing, and because of the fact that I was married to a foreign guy. I just want to make sure two things. First, and I think we talked about this many times when he was in prison, and we met behind one of those windows when you talk through telephones, exactly the way you see it in the movies. We promised each other to make sure we do whatever we can, to the extent that we can, to make sure it's really huge and impossible, but we try to make sure no one else will go through what we have been through. And if we hear from folks that are going through similar experiences, we make sure that we give them, as voiceless people at the moment, we become their voice. That's why now I work for the committee to protect journalists, to make sure no other colleagues of mine everywhere in the world doesn't experience what we have experienced. And that's what Jason is doing about all hostages, especially those who are detained in Iran. So for now, that's what I'm doing. We're hoping we can create a little baby. That's another plan.
Agreed 100%, but I also think that it's part of our purpose to live our lives and enjoy them and do the things that we want to do, but do them in ways that enrich not only ourselves but other people as well. So, you know, we try and be, you know, light imprint campers, and I just like to continue experiencing things and writing about them. I mean, I think my purpose was to explain a place in a situation that most people don't have the opportunity to get close to, and I did. And now we're in a different place that most people don't have the opportunity to get that close to. And so I continue to do the same thing. And I hope that that's something that I can continue to do throughout my career and my life, because it's what keeps me engaged and interested and excited. And I think that there's value.
I just want to say it's been such an honor and privilege and inspiration to talk to you both. Thank you so very much.